Well, good afternoon. And yes, we'd like to just follow up what our president has just said. We are going to look at a subject which is got a lot of information that we could show you, because the history of the Jews, the Israelites, goes back a number of thousands of years, and obviously then to go through absolutely everything that is we know about the history of the Jews would take us quite a while. So what we're going to do is to go through and pick up some main points, and the whole purpose of this is to highlight that these things were revealed to people, to faithful people, as they heard the word of God and realised that God has a purpose with the Jews. And so it is that really we could rename this subject as well, that the Jews are the witnesses to God. Because when you look at the history of the Jews and what they've gone through, we can quite clearly see, if we have an open mind and an honesty about these things, we can see that the Bible clearly tells us a lot about the Jews, and that it told these things before they actually happened. Now, it is therefore, because this is obviously, we're talking about the Bible, the reason why we can use the Bible is for one of the reasons is the Bible and the Middle East are very well linked. Because the Bible has a direct connection with the Middle East itself. So it speaks of the Israelites, the Jews, and the nations that are around that country. And that the people who wrote the Bible, these inspired writers that were moved by God, were themselves located in that area. And as a result then, the things that they spoke of very often spoke of events from the Middle East and the surrounding areas. So they spoke about their experiences and what was happening in the nations, and more specifically what was happening in Israel. Because everything about these things was all centered around the people of God. And so therefore it discussed people in the Middle East. And it provides, and it certainly did, the further we go back, it provided prophecies for the future of the Middle East. And so one of the purposes of today is to look at the past and help see how the Bible predicted our past, and therefore we have the confidence in the future. So if we can honestly, with an open heart, look at the past and go, yes, it's very clear that the Word of God, the Bible, absolutely prophesied these things, and our history backs that up, then what it speaks about the future of the Jews, we must have a lot of confidence that these things are going to happen as well. And the fact that the Bible was written over quite a long period of time, around about 1500 years, we're told, it shows that with its consistency and its prophecies and how it all connects, we can clearly see that the person who was the overriding writer of the Bible was absolutely God. And it is therefore an authoritative source. We can rely on what it says and tells us. Now, we're obviously going to use the Bible as the main focus of what we're going to look at. But perhaps when we start speaking to people about the Jews, what is it that they might first think of? Well, it's quite likely that they will think only of the current situation that's happening now. We all are aware, quite easily, because of the way news is transferred in multiple formats and around the world, that Israel are now steeped in a war. Now, that has eased a little bit at the moment, the fact that they've got a peace agreement with Hezbollah, however long that will last. And as we will look at a slide in a moment, people may have doubts of this peace because of history again. But currently they're still at loggerheads with those in Gaza, with Hamas. And obviously both of these are connected with Iran. And as we know, Iran and Israel just don't see eye to eye at all. Iran have always sworn to destroy Israel. They don't believe they belong where they are. But that's for another argument. But this is where most people will automatically head, is the current situation. But if you were to look at the history of the Jews, we'll find actually what we're witnessing today is perhaps nothing new, because it seems to be very cyclical. There's peace and then there's war. There's peace and there's war. And it's very almost consistent. Because if you were to look at the wars of Israel, you'll find, there you go, at the bottom right there, we have the 2024 Israel-Hezbollah war, or Operation Northern Arrows, and just before that is Israel-Hamas war, which started last year. October the 7th was the start, as we know, and they're the current wars. But if you go back, you will see how regular they are, all the way up to 1948, which is quite an interesting date, which we'll pick up on later. So from 1948 all the way up to this year, there's been consistent war, peace, war, peace. Some would say that perhaps there never really is peace because they never really seem to agree, do they? Israel and some of the surrounding nations. So Israel has a very difficult history up to 1948, which for some is still fairly relevant in the fact that there'll be some people who are still alive and born around that time. So it's quite recent history, isn't it? But it's a lot that's happened. But what we find is Israel, the history of Israel can be traced way back beyond that, over 4,000 years at least. We could say it goes right back to the beginning of time, really. But as Israel themselves, as a people and the people, the fathers of Israel, we can certainly go back to at least 4,000 years. So we're not talking from 1948 to today, we're going a lot further back. Now most countries will have a history that goes quite far back. But one of the remarkable things about Israel is that despite what's happened to them as a people, they've always managed to survive as a people. And they've lived beyond other nations, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medes and Persians. Now, yes, their descendants are still with us, but them as an actual nation have disappeared. But Israel have always managed to continue, despite what's happened to them, which is remarkable in its own right. Now, we mentioned the beginning times of Israel, and so what we could do is very briefly, we could look at a man called Abraham. We could start there as a starting point. Now, why Abraham? Well, again, we see the brilliance of the history of the Jews is we can very easily trace it all the way back to this man. It's an incredible lineage that we have leading back to this man called Abraham. And what we find, very briefly, we could spend a talk just on our own looking at Abraham and what was promised him and to his descendants, to his son Isaac, and then to his grandson Jacob, and then to his great-grandchildren, and so on and so forth. These promises that were made to these people. And what we find very briefly, when up there on the passage that's Genesis 13, and some of the verses they take from there, God speaks to Abraham. He's known as Abram then, but he had his name changed because of the promises that were made, and his name was changed to Abraham because he was going to be a father of many nations. And if you look at the original language, we can understand why Abraham's name was changed. But here it's mentioned as Abram, but it is the same person. And we're told that Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan. Now again, if we looked at the history of Canaan, we'd realise that he's talking about the same land that Israel dwells in now. So we're talking about Israel or Palestine or Canaan, however we wish to look at it. It is the same land. And the Lord said unto Abram after that Lot was separated from him, which was his nephew, lift up now thine eyes and look from the place where thou art northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. And here's a promise that God made to Abraham. He says, everything you can see from this vantage point will be blessed and given to you as an inheritance, and to your seed, your descendants after you, he says. And that was what was promised. So we have a very sure foundation stone here on the history of Israel. But for some, this will still be a problem, which we'll mention in a moment. And we've briefly mentioned how that we can look at the descendants, the family tree of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then what's known as the 12 children of Jacob, which became known as the 12 tribes of Israel, as their families grew and grew and grew in Egypt, where they dwelt. At some point, they became a nation, and these became known as the 12 tribes of Israel. And so there on the right of the screen, you see we've just put Israel, because that's what eventually happened. The people, the descendants of Abraham, grew into a nation as he was promised. Now, it's also interesting just to point out that he did have another son called Ishmael, which is one of the sore points, really, between Israel and some of her surrounding nations, is this issue of Ishmael, who eventually became he was the father of the Arab nations that we may call. But we're not going to go into arguments now of Ishmael and Isaac and their descendants. But this is one of the arguments that some Arab states will have, is that really everything that was promised went through Ishmael, not Isaac. I do remember arguments of this kind in the past, and that's what they're adamant, that's what they say, despite what the Bible says. And then what we can do is we progress through the history that's revealed in the Bible from Abraham onwards, and they become a nation, and God pulled them out of Egypt where they were dwelling at the time due to a famine. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's the simplistic way of saying it at the moment. And then God said, I'm now going to pull you out and take you to the land that was promised to your father Abraham. And this is what God said to this now a nation of people. And he said to them in Deuteronomy 7 verse 6, Thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, above all people that are upon the face of the earth. Now this is Moses speaking. He was chosen by God to be the head of this people Israel, and to pull them out of Egypt and to take them to Canaan, which were, if you remember, in what God promised to Abraham, to take them to that land that was promised. And Moses is saying, you are an holy people. You're a separate people to God. He's chosen you because of the promises that he made unto your fathers, Abraham and his descendants. And you are a special people to him, above all people. And that's what God promised to them. He says, you are my people, you are my special people. And that highlighted the special bonds that God now had with these people because of the promises he had made. And we find that God never left them as a result of this. We could spend time from this point looking at how Israel failed and they were punished by God as a result. As our president said, there is so much history we could look at. But we don't want to dwell on these points today. But we could go from this point forward and spend quite a bit of time looking at the history of the progression of the people of Israel and see how that they didn't listen to God, despite what he had done to them and what he'd blessed them with and what he'd promised to them. And they wished to depart and do the things of those nations that were around them, which God said that they shouldn't do. And so he punished them. And then they came back and they punished them as they left again. But eventually we would come to points of great blessing where God again spoke to faithful people. And one of those examples is another man, another famous person, a great king of Israel. So at this point they had now become a kingdom. And that is important. And where was their kingdom? Well, it was the land that they were taken to. And they eventually dwelt in Canaan, the land of Israel, that was promised by God and was given to them. And so here we have this famous King David, and he's in Israel, he's in Jerusalem, and God is now saying, I'm now going to promise some amazing things to you as well, as part of my purpose. And he's going to reveal certain things to him that are vital to the future aspect of Israel. And what he says in 2 Samuel chapter 7 is this. Now, it's not all of it, it's not everything, but we're just picking out this little bit of information that God has revealed to us through his word. And he promised David this. He says, when thy days be fulfilled, so after you have died, he's saying, thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, and I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build an house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So here we have, interestingly, God gave these promises to a descendant of Abraham. It's very important to understand this. David was a descendant of Abraham. It's all linked. We can see the lineage of these people. And so David was then the king of Israel, and he was the faithful believer in God. That is also important. And because of his faith, God gave these certain promises to him. And very quickly they were that David's seed would be set up after him. So in the eyes of man, that is vital, isn't it? If you were king, you wanted your son to be king and your son's son to be king. You wanted your name to be on the throne forever. Now that's not the reason why God promised David. But what he's saying is that this will happen to you. He says, I will set your seed up after you. So he's promised you will have a future. Your family line will have a future. And he's saying that God would establish his, that is David's seed, would establish his kingdom. So he's promised to David that after you've died, your kingdom will be established. Your seed's kingdom will be established whenever that would be. And that God would establish the throne of his, that is David's seed's kingdom forever. So there's an interesting point here, isn't it? He's not only promising that the lineage of David would stay on the throne and that his kingdom would be established and your seed would sit upon that throne and continue. He's now saying, I'm promising this forever. So I'm not just giving that to your next son and maybe your son's son and then we'll see how it goes. He's saying, at some point I will establish this kingdom and it will be forever. Now already you may be clocking on to the point is, well, they're not a kingdom now, so has God broken his promise? Or is this now something future that God is revealing to us? So what we can do is put Abraham and David side by side and look at the promises that were made to Israel and say, well, we have a promised land for his descendants, that is Abraham's descendants. And then with the promises of David, we have promise of inheritance and a king of the people of Israel in that promised land, and that God would establish the throne and kingdom forever. So we can see this incredible picture that God is providing for us. He's saying to these descendants of Israel, of Abraham, and to Abraham he's saying, your people will be in a land, it will be a kingdom, there will be a king ruling over you, and it will last forever. Now, for non-believers in the Bible, they will say, well, that's just fairy tale. There's no proof of that. The Bible's a load of rubbish. It doesn't, it just says these things, but I have no evidence of it. Well, that was the beauty of the Bible, is that what it tells us and how we can link it to history, we suddenly realise that these things aren't just fairy tales. They have a lot of substance to them. But the issue is that they will always look at the current situation, certain people. And for example, like Hebrews 11, it says, well, these things never happened. And it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he went out, not knowing whither he went. By faith, he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. And so the Bible explains already before that there's a reason for this. This is, it wasn't meant to happen then. Despite what was promised by God, he was saying to them that this is actually futuristic to their time, that it would be happen in the future times. And so doubters today who say, well, there is no kingdom, there is no king, would have to say, well, it's obviously therefore still future. So to say that it's not happened and they're not in this position does not prove that the Bible's wrong. It just states that what God has promised is still yet to happen. But these people of faith looked forward to that time, knowing that it wasn't now, but it would be future to their time. So we mentioned about Israel and the choices that they had. Now, in Deuteronomy 30 and verse 19, we could look at this, and Israel and God through Moses gave them a choice. And he said, listen to the things that you're being told by God. And if you do, you'll, on this left-hand side, you'll have life and blessing. And then we could look at Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 1 and the verses that precede and see that these amazing blessings that God promised that he would give to his people Israel. It says, on the other hand, if you wish to ignore God, you'll end up going down the other side, death and cursing. And then from Deuteronomy 28 and verse 15 and onwards, God reveals a load of curses that would come upon the people of Israel. And so he's warning them beforehand, isn't he? It's like a father with a child. The child, you could say, well, look, I'll give you a choice. You can go and do this thing that I've told you not to do. You can go and do that, that's your choice. But this is the punishment that you will have as a result. But if you don't do that, then great. You'll be blessed for that. You won't be punished. And so God's revealing this choice to Israel. He's saying, you can still go and do these things, but I've already revealed to you and warned you of the consequences of disobedience. But I've also given you these incredible blessings to look forward to if you are to listen. Well, what we find is history tells us that Israel decided to either agree with that or disagree on multiple times. And this is a very simplistic way of looking at it. But what we find is we would find that Israel went through a history of peace, unrest, peace, unrest, peace, unrest. If you look at the book of Judges, for example, it perfectly highlights this. Children of Israel decided they wanted to do what they wanted to do. Punishments came upon them as a result. They realized the error of their way. They called to God. God listened because he was their God and they were his people and he loved them. And as a result, he came and delivered them through judges. And they saved them from the people that were warring against them or the other issues that they had. And so they came peaceful again. But then they fell away again. And this was a very cyclical thing that happens. And you can go through the book of Judges and see this. And so we find Deuteronomy 28 and verse 1 was true when peace was around, and then Deuteronomy 28 and verse 15 certainly would happen when they had unrest. But the important thing here is Israel have never been destroyed by God during times of unrest. If you were to look at the history period of this time and see some of the things that they went through as a result of their disobedience, it's amazing, really, how Israel survived. But it's because God has never allowed it. In fact, in Jeremiah chapter 13, verse 11, he says this, I am with thee, saith the Lord, to save thee. Though I make a full end of all nations whither I have scattered thee, yet I will not make a full end of thee, but I will correct thee in measure and will not leave thee altogether unpunished. So here's this underlying promise of God. Despite the punishments that will come upon you, I will never allow you to cease as a people. And you look at some of the history that we're going to briefly look at, and you will wonder how a people could ever survive. Because God has promised that he would never destroy them totally. And the history is incredibly proof of this promise. And so what we're going to do now is look at some of the history and look at how it demonstrates the incredible accuracy of the prophecies of God and how it accurately proves Deuteronomy chapter 28. And it's really worth studying Deuteronomy 28 and what's written, because it lays out so accurately the history of Israel and what they were going to go through. Another book, though, is Daniel chapter 2. In fact, a lot of Daniel is worth looking at. But specifically and very quickly, Daniel chapter 2 also reveals the history of Israel before it happened. Now we're at the point where we've now reached a certain part of Deuteronomy chapter 28 where it shows that they would be taken by people and they would end up being captured. And in Daniel chapter 2, they are now at the point of being in their captive in the land of Babylon. And we can't go into it all now, but it shows how Daniel shows the then king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, that after him would come other world empires. Our history tells us that Daniel was absolutely accurate in what he said, and this could only happen if God was with him. Now, it's also worth noting, so basically what we're saying is that we're here at this point in Daniel 2, we're at Babylon, and what Daniel shows through his prophecy revealed by God, that after Babylon would come the Medes and Persians, which was representative of the silver portion of this statue that Nebuchadnezzar dreamt of. And then after that, with the belly and thighs of brass, which was representative of Greece, and then we have the legs of iron, which were representative of the Roman Empire. And then after the Romans, it declares that there would be a section of world empires that were weak and strong. So no specific overruling empire. It's worth noting that after the Romans, there wasn't this other world empire that ruled over Israel as a nation. And this is because by the time the Ottoman Empire came to the land of Israel and the surrounding nations, Israel in large had been removed from the land and scattered amongst the nations. Because some people would say, Daniel 2 isn't accurate because the Ottoman Empire ruled over the land of Israel at that point in time. There was another world empire. And so Daniel 2 is wrong. It's missed out the Ottoman Empire. But there's a reason for that, because God is revealing the sequence of empires that affected his people Israel. And during the Ottoman Empire, Israel had ceased to be a nation in the land of Israel at that time. There were Jews in the land, but they were not noted and not seen as the people of God as a nation. And there's a reason for that, as we'll come to in a moment. So we go back to Deuteronomy 28 at this point. Because it says here in Deuteronomy 28 verses 49 to 50 that the Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favour to the young. And if we were to study Deuteronomy 28, we'd come to this point and realise that it's describing how they would be subject to the punishments if they failed to follow God in the way that he desired, and that he had chosen Israel to be his people and commanded they worshipped him in righteous ways. That Israel failed, and so the history of the Jews has been written in fulfillment of the curses of Deuteronomy 28. And in these verses here, it aligns with Daniel 2 and why the Roman Empire was the last empire to rule over Israel. So in Deuteronomy 28, it shows that the Romans were a cruel people, and when Israel revolted against the Romans, they were treated to a brutal siege that caused great suffering. But we'll not go into all of that now, other than to show how history lays this out perfectly. What we find is how Deuteronomy 28 and how Daniel 2 are so accurate, because it shows, if you would turn to the history now of the Jews, what was written in our own history books, that when it came to around AD 70, Jerusalem was ultimately taken by Titus because the Jews revolted against the Romans. And then Massala was taken in AD 73. And then Bar Kokhba revolt in AD 132 to 135, which resulted in Betha being taken in AD 135. Don't want to go into any more detail of that, but the sequence shows that after this, then in AD 135, we can show how that the Jewish nationalism was ultimately crushed, and they were prohibited to enter Jerusalem. And so here at this point, that was it. They were crushed as a people. The Romans had conquered the Jewish revolt and ultimately now completely scattered them throughout the land. They removed them from Israel. And you can see how Daniel 2 now shows, doesn't it? No other ruling empire over Israel, because Israel now technically ceased to live as a nation. And they now dwelt just amongst the nations of the known world. And Deuteronomy 28 shows this perfectly, because it says in verse 64 that the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, with neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And so here we see how beautifully God warned them in Deuteronomy 28 that you disobey me, this is going to happen to you. And now in Daniel 2 it reveals that God shows the nations that would follow. And in our own history books we see how that they were written perfectly. And ultimately the Jewish people ceased to exist as a nation from the time of the Romans. And they were scattered among the world. And so it was, the history then, there's a period of around 400 years, I believe, where Israel now ceased to be a nation, or recognised as a nation. And this period was the Ottoman Empire, as we know, ruled over by the Turks. And then eventually in World War I, they were overcome by the British and defeated the Ottomans, and they were given control of of the land of Palestine, as it was known then. So now the British are in control of the land that we now know of as Israel, or Palestine, as some refer to it, and as it was referred to back then. So here we are now at World War I. British are now in control of the land, but there is no known nation of Israel. And so time carries on. This is the situation. The Jews are in all the nations, and they suffer by whatever goes on in those nations. And then we arrive at World War II. And ultimately now, this is to be one of the biggest tests of the survival of the Jewish people. We're not going to go into it any more until we know about the Holocaust. Approximately 6 million or to 7 million Jews were destroyed by Hitler and his regime, believing that they needed to be destroyed. What other nation can we say who've gone through so much history as the Israelites? Conquered by Babylon, then the Medes and Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans, conquered by the Romans, scattered throughout the world. And even there, even though they were not a nation, they're being destroyed by Hitler and his men and his regime. Why is it they still suffer? Well, that's because God warned them again. Disobey me and these things will happen. And in Deuteronomy 28 verses 65 to 67, God said that among these nations shalt thou find no ease. How true that was. Neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest, but the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart and a failing of eyes and sorrow of mind, and thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, shalt have none assurance of thy life. In the morning thou shalt say, would God it were even, and at even thou shalt say, would God it were morning, for the fear of thine heart wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes which thou shalt see. So God said, you won't find rest once you've been scattered. You're going to have troubles as a result of this. And the Holocaust was one great example of how this fulfilled this section of Deuteronomy 28. But all hope wasn't lost. Now remember what it said in Jeremiah 30. Despite this, I will never cause you to cease as a people. There would be many, I'm sure, when they witnessed the Holocaust, to think that's the end of the Jewish people. How many were killed by the hand of Hitler? People needed to remember Deuteronomy 30. Despite this, God had promised they would never cease as a people. And so it was, hope then came on the horizon eventually, which actually started way back towards 1917, I believe it was, known as the Balfour Declaration, where the British back then declared that they would do what they could to help the Jews have a land again. And there's just a snippet. It says there, His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, to use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. So that's what the British were saying back then, known as the Balfour Declaration, back in 1917. We believe that the Jews should have a home in the land of Palestine, and we will help as best as we can to achieve this. But it's important to also note it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. But we will not cause it to be a problem, they said, with those that were already in the land. It wasn't a state of kicking out everybody and then the Jews to dwell there. They were trying to get them to live harmoniously with the people that were already there. And then we have here that there was a mandate written in 1923, which now progressed this further. An agreement between the United Kingdom and France confirmed the border between the British Mandate of Palestine and the French Mandate of Syria. And it goes on to say how the British handed over certain areas, the Golan Heights, the French in return for the northern Jordan Valley. And the border was redrawn so that both sides of the Jordan River and the whole of the Sea of Galilee, including a 10-metre wide strip along the north-eastern shore, were made a part of Palestine, with the provisions that Syria have fishing and navigation rights in the lake. And so this is now progress of the original Balfour Declaration in this mandate for Palestine in 1923. Things are being drawn up. And then it progresses further. By 1948, there's this UN partition, but ultimately it led to war, which is perhaps no surprise. And we're now at that point of that list of problems, those conflicts that we've had since 1948. Here it says on the 29th of November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly, voting 33 to 13 in favour with 10 abstentions, adopted Resolution 181, recommending a partition with the Economic Union of Mandatory Palestine to follow the termination of the British Mandate. The plan was to partition Palestine into an independent Arab state alongside a Jewish state, and the special international regime for the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was to encompass Bethlehem. Zionist leaders, including the Jewish Agency for Israel, accepted the plan, while Palestinian Arab leaders rejected it, and all independent Muslim and Arab states voted against it. So here is this option, saying, here we go. This is how we're going to get you to live side by side. We're going to give you a Palestinian state, and we're going to give you an Israeli state. Israeli said, that's fine, we'll do that. But unfortunately, as we can see there, the Palestinian and Arab leaders rejected it. And so it was, at this point, war broke out as a result of it. And it's now known, and we can see how they've held on to this as a result of what happened, that in April-May, the offences of Yishuv forces defeated the Arab forces and Arab-Palestinian society collapsed. By the time the armistice was signed, some 700,000 Palestinians caught up in the turmoil fled or were driven from their homes. This event is now known as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. So Israel accepted it, but they were then immediately attacked to try and remove them from this. But remember what God said. You will not be destroyed. And this is actually now proof of other words that we'll look at in a moment, that God had promised that one day they would actually return to this land. And what we're seeing then here through this history is the fulfillment of these things. But it's as a result of Israel being attacked that those that were attacking were ultimately removed, because Israel defended themselves as a result. But they now see this, the Palestinian people and her allies, as this catastrophe. And they use that as a means now to continue with what they perceive to be their right to try and force Israel out of the land. But this didn't stop Israel, because of what was promised and what was written up. On 14th of May 1948, David Ben-Gurion and the Jewish People's Council declared the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, as they called it, or the land of Israel, to be known as a state of Israel. And so Israel went ahead with what was promised and agreed. So we've accepted it, so we're now going to establish ourselves as the state of Israel. And that is what happened. And this, though, was now the absolute beginning of the issues of the Middle East between Israel, the Palestinians and their supporters. And since this time, many Jews have returned to the land of Israel, and the numbers continue to grow. And this is, again, a fulfillment of a prophecy that God had made so long before in Jeremiah chapter 32, where it says, "Behold, I will gather them out of all countries, whither I have driven them in mine anger and in my fury and in great wrath. And I will bring them again unto this place, and I will cause them to dwell safely." And so what we've witnessed since 1948 to our day is the slow fulfillment of this promise of God, that one day I will bring them back. And now again we have a people of Israel in the land, known as the State of Israel. They are now a recognised people again, although some would argue against that, of course. But that is what was promised by God. I will never completely destroy you, but I will also now gather you again. Now it speaks here of them dwelling safely. Now there's the situation. Are they ever dwelling safely? So perhaps this is still future obviously to these things. But what it is that God is preparing the area for the next part of his purpose. That's the key thing. We see the fulfillment of these prophecies and the beginning of the fulfillment of these prophecies in the history of Israel, and we will find that God is now preparing the way for the things that are now future to our time. Because we've reached current day, haven't we? We've reached from 1948 to 2024, we've reached to our day. History proves the Bible, absolutely. That is why it's the amazing history of the Jews. And it absolutely shows how the Jewish people are the witness of God. So what next? What about the future? If the past is so accurate and so believable, which if we had an honest heart, we'd have to accept that the Bible clearly is speaking of these things and has spoken of these things, and they've been fulfilled through the people of Israel and the nations that were with them. So what of the future? What is it that God reveals about the future? Well, sadly, it starts off with troubled times for Israel again. And it speaks of a final battle for Israel, which to some will be known as Armageddon, which is revealed in Revelation. We don't need to go into that now and explain about Armageddon as such. But God has said there is going to be a period of difficulty for Israel as part of my purpose. And it says in another prophecy, Zechariah, in chapter 14, it says, "For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. Cities shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished. And half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations, as when he fought in the day of battle." Now, if we left it there, which we will do today, but we can easily demonstrate otherwise, reading that on its own, they could say, well, that could mean any period of time in history of Israel. But if you were to look further into Zechariah and Revelation and Ezekiel chapter 38, we realize that this is a period of time that has not yet happened with Israel. So this is futuristic to our day. It's in our future. It could be tomorrow. It could be in a month's time. We don't know exactly. But God has said that this is happened. And we have confidence in this prophecy because of all the other prophecies that have been fulfilled. And so God is saying there is a day coming when it's going to get pretty bad for Israel again. I'm going to gather nations against them and then cause it that half of Jerusalem will fall. Now, what is the one thing that the Jews are absolutely adamant about? They will not give up Jerusalem at all. They have control of the whole of Jerusalem. But the Palestinians want the east of Jerusalem, don't they? I believe it's the east. They want half of Jerusalem back. But at the moment, Israel hold the whole of Jerusalem. But here we have a prophecy that one day they will lose half of Jerusalem again. But not just by them handing it over. It's clear that there'll be great suffering as a result of it as they try and stop this from happening. But the important thing at the end is that when this happens, the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. It will not be a total destruction and stoppage of Israel as a people again. God will ultimately intervene. When? Well, we don't know the exact reason why the nations will come. And maybe it's a force to Israel into dividing Jerusalem. Maybe that's the actual reason for it to come. And to say that enough, Israel, you have to give some of the land back to the Palestinians. Maybe that's one of the reasons. We don't know. What we do know is it will be because of the purpose of God. Ezekiel 38, it describes the same prophecy, but in more detail. And there in verse 8, it says, after many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword and gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste. But it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. Now in verse 11, which we're not going to put up on the screen, it says, thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. And what it speaks of in Ezekiel 38 is a leader known as Gog, and he will have a great following of people. And he will say this in verse 11, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest. They dwell safely. All of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. So it speaks of it suggests a time of peace. So maybe there will be peace one day in the land of Israel between her and her allies. Sorry, her and her enemies. But when this happens, it talks about how this conglomerate of nations will ultimately come up against Israel at that time. But it will be the beginning of this last battle in Israel. But God has shown that Jerusalem will just be as burdensome stone for these nations, as it always has been. In Zechariah 12 and verse 8, and in that day I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. All that burden themselves with it shall be cut in pieces, though all the people of the earth be gathered together against it. Now, history tells us, doesn't it, how that Jerusalem has always been an issue. And that's exactly the problem of today. It's one of the key arguments between Israel and her enemies. And we're told here, aren't we, that these nations that will come up against Jerusalem will ultimately have an issue because of it. It will be as a burdensome stone for all these people, despite them coming up to fight against it. And so it won't be a typical war. It's not going to be a war that we've seen since 2023 and this year, where Israel fight it out with Hezbollah and Hamas, and the world watches or supplies weapons for them. It's not going to be a war like that where we just watch and see what happens. This is a war that will be absolutely different, because Israel will not be able to defend themselves. But we know that God will intervene at this point. This is the one war that the world cannot succeed at, because God himself will intervene and will cause his purpose to be brought about. And what he has promised in Daniel 2 as a result of this, in verse 44, that in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. And so what God has promised, that ultimately one day God would intervene and set up a kingdom, which we saw, didn't we? With promises to David, that one day he would set up this kingdom. And it will be this period of time when God will intervene and cause this to happen. Now we could briefly look at what David also was promised about a king. We could look at Ezekiel 21, where it talks about the end of the kingdom. And then in Luke 2, we could link that with the Lord Jesus Christ, how he was promised. You can see there on the screen that his name shall be Jesus, he shall be great, shall be called the Son of the Highest, and the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David. So there's proof there that the Lord Jesus Christ was the promised seed to David, that he would ultimately take the throne of David. That's what was promised him. And then we also could spend a lot of time looking at what was promised about the state of this kingdom that would be set up with Jesus as king. We could look at prophecies like Psalm 37, where it says that the meek shall inherit the earth, shall delight themselves in the abundance of peace. And again in Psalm 72, it says, in these days shall the righteous flourish, and the abundance of peace as long as the moon endureth. So God has promised that this period of time, when God intervenes and causes his purpose to be brought about during this time of this last war, that God will bring about the peace that the world so wishes to find. One day he will cause this kingdom to be set up that will bring this incredible peace that is promised to his people Israel. And in Micah 4 it says that he shall judge among many people and rebuke strong nations afar off. He shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. They shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts hath spoken it. And this is what is promised eventually will happen with the people of Israel. It says, yes, you will go through a trial, a real time of great trouble, but at the end of it shall be this great time of peace. And interestingly, this is always quoted, isn't it, by many people, that this is what the aim is of these establishments. The UN, I believe, has this, saying that one day their aim is to bring about this state where there will be no need of weaponry. But history tells us that man is incapable of bringing about this type of peace. But God has promised that one day he will. And this is what is promised for his people Israel. And that one day, despite what's going on at the moment, God has said that people will recognise Israel and that they will desire to be with them. And in Zechariah 8 it says that thus saith the Lord of hosts, it shall yet come to pass, shall come people and the inhabitants of many cities, inhabitants of one city shall go to another, saying, let us go speedily to pray before the Lord and to seek the Lord of hosts. I will go also. Yea, many people and strong nations shall come to seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem, and to pray before the Lord. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, in those days it shall come to pass, that 10 men shall take hold out of all languages of the nations, even shall take hold of the skirt of him that is a Jew, saying, we will go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. And that's the incredible difference, isn't it? This will come about because then God will be seen in the earth. Will not be rejected anymore, and people say that God is a myth and that he's not real. But because of the history of the Jews and what will happen to them in the future, it will be obvious that God is real and that God is with the people of the Jews. And as a result, many nations will then say, well, we're going to be with you, Israel, because clearly God is with you. And this time will bring about a great change in all things. For God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. Shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. It's an incredible promise of peace and change in the world. And we can have great faith in these things because of the prophecies that have already been fulfilled in Israel. Well, this all sounds great for the people of Israel, but why are we speaking about it? Is it because we just have an interest in it? And it's incredible to see that God is with Israel, always has been, always will be, and that one day he will bring about his purpose with the people. Promise him this kingdom, Jesus as king, will cause the nations to accept them as a people. There will be peace amongst these nations. There will be no more weapons, time of peace, and even pain and suffering is removed. This is fantastic for the people of Israel. But what about us? What hope have we got about this? Well, very quickly, if we remember, we spoke about the seed of Abraham, and that the seed of Abraham was promised these things. And we demonstrated that the seed of Abraham became the people of Israel. But in Galatians 3, as a result of what God has done for people who wish to believe these things, what he did through the work of the Lord Jesus Christ and the message that he taught, and the people after him, we find that God has opened a door to anyone who wishes to accept these things and to they themselves be seen as Abraham's seed. So it says in Galatians 3, for if many of you have been baptized into Christ, have put on Christ. So baptism's crucial in this happening. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus. And if ye be Christ's, then are ye Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. And that is the fantastic offer of God to us all. Look what I've done to Israel. Look what I've promised to Israel. If you accept these things and believe what I've taught and said and what Jesus has shown to us and be baptized into Jesus Christ, we can be seen as Abraham's seed. And as a result, we can be heirs of the very same promises that were made to Abraham and his descendants. And ultimately then, we can be blessed with Abraham himself. Says the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the heathen through faith, preached before the gospel unto Abraham, saying, in thee shall all the nations be blessed. So then, they which be of faith are blessed with faithful Abraham. Well, my dear friends, this is an incredible hope that we have as well. And so what we say unto you is, well, watch then. Listen to what is being said. See the history. See what's happening. That the fact that God is in control of the Middle East is obvious, and we needn't worry about what is going on. Instead, watch with interest as it shows that the purpose of God is being carried out. That the Middle East will not be sorted by men and women as much as they believe it will be. That peace may be achieved in some form, but it won't be stable. God has promised eternal peace in his kingdom, and that God has offered us a place in that same kingdom. And our message is to ask that you join us as we watch with interest the things that are happening now in Israel and the surrounding world. And that one day God has promised an idyllic time on this earth with Israel and those that wish to be with her, and with Jesus as king. It says that of Jesus' kingdom and of his government, it says the increase of his government and peace, there shall be no end. So thank you.